Well, thanks, Andy, and it's really great to be an honor to be invited here to Fresno to talk about these things. I'm from Southern California originally, so I was in Fresno several times some years ago, and the campus wasn't as magnificent then as it is now. So it's great to be here, and I hope we can have a good discussion. I will probably talk for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and just introduce some ideas, and then we can have a discussion after that. I was talking to Vina earlier, who suggested I begin by telling you a little bit about myself because I have a rather unorthodox history in relation to academia. And it's one of the reasons why I am particularly interested in political work and how things engage political work. I'm going to give you today a way of thinking about where we are and a way of thinking about what at least one pacifist would say about it. But I'm not going to give you a lot of solutions. I actually think, as always, there's different ideas about how to proceed, so maybe we can talk about that as well. What I will do is lay out a certain way of thinking about where we've come, where we are, and immediately, I mean, in terms of the latest 30-year war we're going to enter into with ISIS, a group that none of us had heard of 6 months ago, even though the budget for the Central Intelligence Agency is billions of dollars to warn us about these things. Somehow we're surprised that the Soviet Union collapses, we're surprised that the Shah of Iran is deposed, and now we're surprised at the very existence of our latest enemy. Okay. I was born in Los Angeles, but moved to New York City when I was in high school, and immediately got involved with a group called the Catholic Workers. The Catholic Workers are now known partly through Dorothy Day, who was the founder of the Catholic Workers. And Dorothy Day was someone that I worked closely with when I was in high school, though she wasn't quite the celebrity that she is now. For those of you who haven't heard of her, she really is sort of the founder of Catholic peace activism. And I think that Dorothy Day is one of the major figures, particularly in changing the Catholic Church, which is my church, from being a very conservative organization on issues of peace and justice to now being a quite good organization, I think, on peace and justice. In working with the Catholic Workers, I ended up working in Mississippi in 1964 through a project that they were doing, and that again now has become sort of this historical thing that people write about. It's odd when you're involved with these things and then people write about them afterwards because they seem interesting at the time, but I don't think we're ever aware of this. And I really became sort of, as a result of those experiences, a civil rights activist, and went to college in the late 60s and continued to be very interested in those things. And it was really just a matter of time until college and my political interests came into conflict. This was the late 1960s. The Vietnam War was going on. And I had been influenced by the Catholic Workers to think of activism as a very personal thing. And that's one type of pacifism and one type of activism, is that it's not just a public policy statement, but it's something that you work to integrate into your life as best you can, though all of us, I'm sure, fall short who try and do it. In any event, I was expelled from college for political work. I actually didn't care at the time. I was so alienated from college that I didn't really respect most of my professors. The Vietnam War was going on, and I honestly didn't care. The main thing I was worried about was getting drafted, because those were the days when if you lost your student deferment, you would be drafted and sent to Vietnam. And any young man of my generation, that was something they thought a lot about, because they didn't know what they were going to do. I escaped that by a very odd series of incidents. I was expelled from college for being involved in a sit-in, which actually was over an issue of racism and discrimination. It was during the Vietnam War, but it was actually over an issue of racist practices of the university. And as happened in those days, I was sent to jail. Now, being sent to jail is not as common for activists as it used to be, but actually if you were someone involved in the civil rights movement, this was something that you experienced. And interestingly, I got my draft notice while I was in jail. So I wrote them back and I said, well, I can't show up for my physical because I'm actually in jail at the moment. And that solved that problem miraculously. Oh, there we go, you know, the twists of fate. I then finally went back to academia. I was telling Andy, I mean, it was partly because I really didn't know what else I was going to do. I thought I would be a full-time activist, but the jobs I was having were really not very interesting, and suddenly the thought of being back in school looked more and more attractive. And so someone who was in the Boston area, which is where I was, who I was friendly with, was Howard Zinn. You may know his name. He wrote this thing, The People's History of the United States, which has become very popular. And he said, well, maybe I could get you into Boston University, even though you don't have an undergraduate degree. Maybe we can figure out a way to sneak you in under some rule. So I got into Boston University and eventually got my PhD, though I still don't have a bachelor's degree. I thought about applying for it, actually. I thought that would be a funny thing to do. First of all, since I went to school before they had computers, I don't know what they even keep records back that far back, but I sort of thought, well, that would be funny. I'd go back and see if I can get my bachelor's degree at my ripe old age. So through much of my academic work, I have really been very interested in the traditions of Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day, Gandhi to some extent, though I've always felt I don't know enough about Gandhi. So this is the tradition of pacifism, nonviolence, non-resistance. There are different names for it. And I think they have different inflections. Certainly the tradition of Dorothy Day and King is one where making the political personal is very, very important. It's a very kind of demanding ethic. It's one that actually, you know, asks you not just what are you doing in terms of the current war, but what are you doing on issues of gender and race. It's very demanding. But I'm going to talk about something a little bit different today, which is much closer to the academic work I do. And that really does have to do with issues of war and peace writ large, where we are in thinking about war and peace, what are the challenges we're facing. And then maybe we can come back at the end to kind of, well, what does this mean for our ordinary lives and the kind of political work we do? Because I don't think it's at all obvious ever, and certainly now, you know, how we make this part of our lives. Now, it is with some irony, and again, I was talking to Vina earlier, it's with some irony that I find myself now working at Oxford University. I'm probably the only person there who doesn't have a bachelor's degree. But I actually think I ended up there because they wanted someone to teach pacifism and nonviolence, quite frankly. They wanted someone to do that. They thought it was an important tradition. They were interested in having someone to do it. They knew me, and so there I go. And I've always sort of thought, well, if nothing else, it kind of shows, I say this to my students, if you really care about something, I think you'll be okay. I think sometimes, you know, you go through these struggles and you persecuted or whatever for it. But I actually think, and I always tried to tell this to my students, in my own life, I thought that finding something I cared about and something ethical and political that I cared about was going to mean that things would work out all right. And I try to encourage people to think about themselves that way. Now, what I've done is I've written on the board, first of all, some figures about the 20th century. I want to talk about, first of all, where we've been in the past. And then I want to talk about where we are now, and then I'll say some things about where we might be going. Okay? Can you hear me all right without the microphone? Okay. Up until about 1970, it was unquestionably true that people were living in the worst century in human history. Now, I don't think anyone realized that at the time, partly because there's probably some resistance to thinking, well, I live in the worst century of human history. But there's no question that in terms of war and conflict, it's very, very difficult to find a century that compares with the amount of killing that took place in the 20th century. Okay? So I've written on the board some figures about the 20th century. Roughly, we had 275 wars in the 20th century. This is up until basically 1989. So we're ending the 20th century essentially with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is a common way of kind of carving it up these days. Of those 275 wars, 250 million people died of politically caused sources, okay? Now, politically caused means that they were either directly killed in battle. About 150 million people were directly killed in battles in the 20th century. But then almost an equal number of civilians died of causes that were politically caused by wars. Now you can see, those of you who are social scientists, you start to think, well, how do we measure that and what do you include or not? But if you add up certainly interstate wars, civil wars, and then certain types of plagues and things which would not have occurred without a war, you get to about 250 million people killed, okay? Now, it's very hard to think in terms of these large numbers, but one way to think of that is that in the 20th century, about 7,000 people were killed every day from a war. Every day, 7,000 people were killed, okay, if you averaged it out. Now, it wasn't averaged out. Most of the killing in the 20th century took place in the two world wars. And we're just now, just a month or so ago, we celebrated the beginning of World War I, the 100th anniversary of World War I. It's really World War I that begins it, and most of the serious killing takes place roughly from about 1914 into the early 1950s. So it's not averaged out over the whole century, but nevertheless, it's a huge number. Now, let me give you some comparative figures, and these are really striking, I think. In the 18th century, the number of people who were killed due to wars was 5 people per 1,000. So in the 18th century, 5 people per 1,000 were killed as a result of a war. In the 19th century, 6 people per 1,000 were killed as a result of a war. In the 20th century, 46 people per 1,000 were killed as a result of war. Notice how huge that is as a multiple from one century to the next, okay? So this is why people who study this say, if you look at the 20th century, the amount of war that took place was really unprecedented. Now, the unprecedented claim, for those of you who are historians, will get you into discussions of the 30 Years' War, you know, from 1600 to 1640, and we could go on, but you can make a clear case that this was unprecedented in the amount of killing. Question I'll raise, not answer, why? Why was the 20th century so bloody? Let me say, by the way, just to anticipate, maybe we can talk about that. If you're thinking it's because of heightened technology, that's clearly not the reason. It's not the improvement of technology. So an interesting question is, why was the century so bloody? But let's just leave that. Maybe we can talk about that. Now, I think what happened was that starting with the end of World War I, people's attitudes towards war started to change. I actually think that experience of what historians call it is hyperwar. We experienced several decades of hyperwar. I think people's attitudes towards war started to change. And I think now there is a qualitative difference between the way that average people think about war today and the way they did 100 years ago. And I think that's a very, very dramatic change. This is something that the best book I know about this is by a man named Joshua Goldstein called Winning the War on War. But another book that talks about is by Steven Pinker. It got a lot of attention, called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Okay. There seems to be a big change. I'll give you just some anecdotal evidence of that in a moment. I call it two things. These are my terms: the Great Disillusion and the Great Defection. The Great Disillusion refers to the fact that people do not look favorably on war as they did in the past. And the great defection refers to the fact that the average person doesn't want to have anything to do with war in a way that they did in the past, okay? So let me say a little bit about these two things. And so now I began with where we were, talked a little bit about the 20th century, moving on to sort of what happened as a result of that. And then I'll start to segue into more recent times and give you in the end kind of how I as a pacifist gives you one way of reading that, okay, and then we can talk about it. I think war has lost its heroism. And one of the best ways to see this, in my view, is to study the life of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was the first modern president in many ways. Theodore Roosevelt was president from 1900 to 1908. He stopped being president just a few years before my father was born, so that was just two or three generations ago in that sense. Theodore Roosevelt was the most popular president of his time, okay? Theodore Roosevelt loved war. He loved war, and he ran for president partly on the basis of that fact. Theodore Roosevelt, throughout his career, wanted to invade Canada because Theodore Roosevelt felt that if we don't have a good war around, we should find one, and the logical thing to do is to invade Canada. They won't put up much of a fight. They speak English. They should be part of the United States anyway. There was a serious, serious movement to invade Canada led by President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, if someone talked that way today, we would think they were psychotic, okay? The Venezuelan boundary dispute. I doubt few of you people have heard of the Venezuelan boundary dispute. The Venezuelan boundary dispute occurred at the end of the 19th century. Then Theodore Roosevelt wanted to declare war on Great Britain over the Venezuelan boundary and where it should be placed. Now, to the average sensible person said, what does it matter that much where the Venezuelan boundary is? Theodore Roosevelt's response was, it doesn't matter that much, but great countries fight great wars. That's what it means to be a great country. And Theodore Roosevelt thought that the country was getting soft. His exact words was womanly. The country was getting womanly. His term was mollycoddles, which is kind of I think a sissy or something like that. And we need a good war to pump us up. It's like political Viagra, okay? We got to get going here again. We got to get the energy up, and that will rejuvenate us. This is, by the way, a constant theme in American history, and we'll come back to that too, of war as rejuvenating, okay? Theodore Roosevelt was the exemplar in the 20th century, first 20th century president, of how war was a good thing. Theodore Roosevelt appointed Oliver Wendell Holmes to the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes is regarded as one of the great, justices of the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the essay that Holmes wrote that got him appointed to the Supreme Court, has the remark, there is nothing that we admire most than a young man dying in war without knowing the purpose for which he's dying. That's what we admire most, someone who dies in war and has no idea what they're dying for. This was Oliver Wendell Holmes. Theodore Roosevelt said, that's my man, I'm going to put him on the United States Supreme Court. This is a different universe than we live in now. I think that war has lost its romance. I think war has lost its enchantment. And I think that is about as big a cultural shift as we've seen in the last 100 years, setting aside in the United States, the American Civil Rights Movement and the long-term implications of that. That's about as big a cultural change as we have. So I call that the great disillusionment. What this means, by the way, is that when the United States, people want the United States to go to war, they always say, we have no choice. That's the argument. It's no longer, we have to be courageous, we have to do it. Always war is packaged now as we have no choice. It's being forced upon us. We just can't do anything else, okay?